Okay, so today we're going to talk about another potential return, well, not another, a potential return to the Garden of Eden stage. The mixing of God or religion and ethics. Another very common way of thinking about ethics that may not be as effective as it first seems. In some ways, this will look a lot like the relationship between the law and ethics. Right? By just following the law, doing what you're told, there's no thinking involved, Garden of Eden stage, authorities tell you, the law says, so on and so forth. You don't really have to think about it. Right? Then from there, then we go to nihilism and relativism, right? These anything goes. And so a response to anything goes is to go back to the Garden of Eden. Right? Well, I just do what God tells me to do instead, or what religion tells me to do, right? The rules of a religion, or God as the authority, or something along those lines. But there are a couple of issues here. And this is not Dr. Shrapi telling you to stop believing in God. This is not Dr. Shrapi telling you to start believing in God. This is not even Dr. Shrapi telling you that God has no place within the realm of ethics. This is merely Dr. Shrapi indicating to you the potential issues and problems that may arise if you choose to invoke God's name when discussing ethics. Problem number one: what if there isn't a God? I mean, if you're going to place it all on this authority thing, there is at least the possibility that that authority does not exist. Now what happens to the structure of all of your ethics if you tie it necessarily to this God thing, and this thing falls apart? Then the other thing falls apart too. No ethics, and we're stuck back with the anything goes. In many ways, nihilism, at least as I presented it as indicative of Nietzsche's thinking. Nietzsche was responding to the Judeo-Christian ethic. God is dead. And so because God is dead, all this ethical structure that Jewish folks and Christians attach to God also falls apart with it. Therefore, no ethics, it's arbitrary, it's made up. Ta-da, now nihilism has its foothold. We can do the success thing instead of the happy thing. Secondly, even if there is a God, which that's a philosophical question, does God exist is a question for philosophy. If so, which one is a question for comparative religion? Even if it's obvious to everyone and everyone agrees that yes, of course God exists, there are how many different religions out there that have different interpretations of this God and different interpretations of what it is that God is asking of them in this life? So again, you're stuck with these disagreeing authorities in the Garden of Eden stage that led to the anything goes stage. So if you're going to tie ethics to religion or ethics to God, you first got to go through the really, really hard work of proving God's existence, and then proving a particular religion's God's existence before you can ever even have the discussion about ethics itself. Now, ethics may be a part of religions, but almost every theory we look at in here can remove that, right? Kant is referenced in your text. Kant has a fully developed ethical theory that has nothing to do with God. Because once you introduce God into the mix, now you have a whole lot of folks not listening. And Kant, at least, wants to have this ethical theory stand or fall on its own merit, whether God exists or not. So that this ethical theory, you can have that discussion with anybody and everybody, regardless of whether God exists, whether they believe that God exists, whether you agree as to which God it is that exists. That ethics is this somewhat separate thing. Furthermore, we also get into the Euthyphro problem, which Berner and Rayleigh talk about. Right? The Euthyphro problem is basically this. And if you're familiar with philosophy of religion questions, then this will sound somewhat familiar to you. So in the Euthyphro dialogue written by Plato, the discussion of ethics comes up again, the discussion of goods and the discussion of goodness. And the question then becomes, okay, are things good because God says so? Or does God merely inform us of things that are necessarily good? He merely recognizes goodness instead of determining goodness. Both answers are problematic for the God believer. Here's why. This is called Euthyphro's dilemma. If you go the things are good because God said so route, then clearly God's power is there. It's evident, right? God says, and therefore that's the way that it is. God's authority and his power. However, if there is a God and God is all-powerful, this would sort of be like a boss, an employer who makes all of the rules. If this employer makes all of the rules, then this employer could change his mind, his or her mind. This employer could be arbitrary. Not that this employer is, but this employer could be. That it would be difficult to feel secure in your job, knowing that the employer could, pardon me, sorry about that, that the employer could come in any day and say, anyone wearing green is fired. And there's nothing you can do about it because this employer is the one who makes all of the rules. God is all powerful. God makes all of the rules. Whatever God says goes. That therefore becomes ethical. So it could be then that ethics becomes arbitrary, that ethics could change. What's ethical one day for one person could end up being unethical the next day for someone else because God told this person one thing and this person something else. Again, this is not Dr. Schrappe claiming there is a God. This is not Dr. Schrappe claiming God is arbitrary or is not arbitrary. This is merely Dr. Schrappe articulating the Euthyphro problem, indicating that by saying this divine command theory, is what it's known as, right? That whatever the divine being commands, therefore becomes ethical, could lead to arbitrariness. Because God is so powerful, God could change one's mind. There are no limits on the power of God. So that one seems problematic. Same as the other one. Maybe God merely recognizes that which is good. Here's the problem with that one. That now limits God's power. God's no longer on top. Instead, these ethical values and so forth are up here. God recognizes them, then passes them down to the rest of us. God's not on top. God's just below these ethical values, which then seems to limit God's power, which ain't good either. Now, in some ways, this is somewhat akin to the philosophy of religion debates about power and love, right? That in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the Muslim tradition, right, that this entity of God, Allah, Yahweh, is all-powerful and also all-compassionate or all-loving. And that's difficult to reconcile, right? The atheist, the agnostic, to some extent, the Eastern religions will come in and say, well, hold on a second, you can't have it both ways here. Because what about evil? Either, granting God exists, either God is all-powerful, he could eliminate evil, and chooses not to because he doesn't love you that much, or God is all-loving and compassionate, he would change it if he could, but he can't because he's not all-powerful. These two seem to run counter to one another in some ways, like the Euthyphro problem, the Euthyphro dilemma. If it's all-powerful, God says so, then it could be somewhat arbitrary. probably not a type of God that you would want to follow, one that could potentially change God's mind. No stability there. Sure, God says not to do this thing right now, but it could be different later. In the Church of the Latter-day Saints, for instance, in their religious tradition, there was a point in time at which God commanded polygamy. Then God came along later and said, no more polygamy. A God that changes God's mind is a very odd conception of God, at least in the Western tradition. The Eastern tradition maybe can do a little bit more with a God who changes his mind, his or her mind. Western tradition, not so much. They're not on board for the arbitrariness, for the changing of God. God is eternal, sort of like Plato's forms, eternal, unchanging. You can have confidence in that. If it's a divine command thing, not much confidence. On the other hand, God merely recognizing and passing that on to us places something else above God. And that doesn't seem to fit most conceptions of God either. Anselm, who attempted to prove the existence of God, said at its fundamental level, when I say God, what you understand by that is the greatest thing. Something than which nothing greater can possibly be thought. The greatest thought, the greatest thing. That's God in a nutshell. So that to then claim that there's some type of ethical value over and above that, God's no longer the greatest thought. These ethical values are the greatest thoughts instead. So again, this is not Dr. Shrapi saying that you can't include God when I ask you to articulate your own ethical theory. This is Dr. Shrapi indicating you're going to have to do a lot of hard work if you do so. You're going to have to give a proof for the existence of God. You're going to have to do apologetics before you ever get to the ethics. You're going to have to indicate what it is that God adds to the ethics. And furthermore, I haven't mentioned this one yet, how is it that you know what it is that God is asking? This is especially important in the divine command side, which is where in these debates most people tend to lean. Most people tend to lean on the divine command side instead of the other side of this dilemma, that they dismiss the arbitrariness. Well, God could change God's mind, but God won't. Very complicated if you look at the Jewish scripture or the Christian scripture, because in there it does kind of seem like God's character might change. God commands that one of his followers sacrifice their son to him. Is that the type of God you want to follow? One who asks something like that of you? The very same God who later on we'll talk about, taking innocent lives, that's a problem. It's not good. The very same God who in other stories will ask one of the kings of his chosen people to wipe out an entire other group of folks, women and children included, presumably innocents. Even the livestock, he wants those wiped out too. Doesn't seem like a very loving God. Powerful to be sure. But loving? And so most folks fall on this divine command theory side. And if you're going to fall on this divine command theory side, an additional problem is, how the heck do you know what it is that he's commanding of you? What's the access that you have to these commands? Is it merely the scripture, which is a text and is therefore open to various multiple interpretations? So you and I may read the same text. You may interpret it very differently than I do. And in Judaism, there's this long history of rabbis disagreeing with other rabbis' interpretations of the scripture. No, 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 Rabbi so-and-so is wrong. Here's what this really means. No, 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 Rabbi so-and-so is wrong. Here's what it really means. Here's what it really means. Here's what it really means. There's interpretation involved there if you're tying it to text. If you want to tie it to some type of prayer, then what type of verification or justification do you get on what it is that you think God is telling you to do, or what it is that you think God is asking of you? I mean, imagine the Abraham story. Imagine Abraham's your buddy, and he comes to you and says, hey man, God told me to sacrifice Isaac, so I'm heading to the mountain today. I'll see you tomorrow. Many of you, I would presume, would be like, whoa, hold on a second, man. Wait. How do you know this is God that told you to do this? And this isn't some other type of thought going on up here. Was there any verification? Do any of your friends, did they also get this? Hey, tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It becomes very problematic very quickly. And so the other ethical theories that we're going to look at in this class, the ones going forward, virtue ethics, deontology, utilitarianism, care ethics, if you happen to believe in God, you can follow these theories and still believe in God. Even though you can follow these theories and not believe in God just as well. God's not an essential component of these theories. And again, Kant specifically, who's referenced in your text, is a believer in God, but intentionally comes up with a theory that does not need God to work. In part because of all of these other issues that arise if you're going to tie ethics to God and religion. What's interesting is here in the state of Ohio, just a few summers ago, the General Assembly passed a law. So notice we have laws now coming into the mix too, laws and religion and ethics and all of this stuff that gets so messy so quickly, which is part of the reason why Shrapi wants to strip some of this extraneous stuff away and focus merely on the ethics. I don't care what the law says. I don't know what the ethical thing to do is and what criteria are we using other than because the law said so. I don't know what criteria are we using to determine ethics other than because God said so. I want the critical thinking stage. I want the criteria, the justification, right? That here in the state of Ohio, lawmakers, bipartisan, by the way, were so concerned about the moral direction of high school graduates that they passed a law saying that high schoolers can receive high school credit, elective credit, for religious instruction. So if they go to their temple or mosque or church or temple or wherever. Now obviously this opens up all sorts of other cans of worms and Pandora's boxes, right? What if I happen to adhere to the, what's the one? The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monsters. Do I get credit for that? But the thinking is, look, notice the initial insight here by the lawmakers. They're associating religion with ethics. We're worried about ethics. We're worried about the way people are treating one another. We're worried about the moral decay of this country or something along those lines. One way to combat that then is to give them credit for religious instruction. The presumption being if you're receiving religious instruction, you will therefore be more ethical. That by being religious, you will therefore be more ethical. Here's some Shrapi. Shrapi's not sure that's necessarily the case. Shrapi knows plenty of ethical folks who adhere to no religion. He also knows a whole bunch of folks who at least claim to adhere to a religion who don't really seem to behave that ethically. These two are not necessarily tied together in the way that many believers of God presume them to be. And so I'm treading lightly here. Because this is an ethics class, this is not a comparative religions class, where we would dive more deeply into, God and which God and the differences between them and the similarities between them and so on and so forth, actually compare and contrast religions and religious traditions. That's not what we're doing here, though I'm getting very, very close. This is also not Intro to Philosophy, where we spend some time discussing proofs for the existence of God. And we look at them just like we would any other argument by assessing the justification, by assessing the criteria. Much more so than the conclusion. Because what these things have in common are they require critical thinking about. Even believers of religious traditions and of religions and of God and so on and so forth, almost all of them will speak about, look, I have to go through this process on my own. I have to figure this thing out on my own. I have to go through the experience on my own. It's about my relationship with God. It's not, my parents were such and such, therefore I am also by birth. That's not the way it works. As that Garden of Eden stage, well, the authorities say, so I guess I must follow it. And there's frequently a reaction against that at some point, typically also in the adolescent stage, sometimes a little bit later into the early 20s. There's rebellion against some of these Nietzschean insights about, power and so on and so forth, and authorities trying to oppress and hold people back and whatnot. And so this dismissing it completely because people who claim to follow that particular entity suck doesn't necessarily mean that that entity is untrue. To dismiss it completely is also not using critical thinking. Critical thinking is required for determining whether God exists or not, for determining if so, which one. And ethics is already doing enough hard work with critical thinking about ethics that it doesn't need this extra baggage thrown onto it. Man, in order to critically think about ethics, I have to first critically think about God and religion. Like, whoa, this is kind of heavy, man. Like, I'm just trying to figure out, what do I do with grandma when she gives me a bad gift? And quite frankly, again, I've read most of the major religious texts of most of the major religions. I double majored in religious studies and philosophy as an undergraduate. So I've read them all at least once, many of them a couple of times. I don't recall any of them saying, so when grandma gives you a bad gift, here's what you should do. When you accidentally hit a parked car in a parking lot, here's what you should do. When you find out that your friend is cheating on their significant other, here's what you should do. Again, you can interpret various aspects as saying certain things to you. But at what point is that the scripture itself revealing itself, and at what point is that you reading into the scripture what you want to read into the scripture? That you already have your idea of the right answer. Now you're just looking for a verification and justification for that. Again, that's way more you than it is this entity God or this particular religious tradition or anything along those lines. In short, just like combining ethics and law makes things messier, not cleaner, same thing with ethics and God or ethics and religion. It makes it messier, not cleaner. It causes more problems rather than solving problems. So I propose that, again, I'm not asking you to denounce the existence of God or anything ridiculous like that. I'm not saying you have to be a God believer either. I'm just saying that with regards to the ethics discussions that we're going to have, we have to be very, very careful, and by we I mean you all, have to be very, very careful about when and where and how you go about invoking God if you choose to do so, and being aware of these possible ramifications for doing so. Okay? So This was just kind of a 25-minute warning about the role that God plays with regards to ethics. And I think Berner really did a pretty nice job in the chapter 2 articulating some of the potential issues with doing so. Ethics is kind of its own separate thing, a little bit apart and separate from law, though closely touching but not connected to. Same deal with ethics and religion and God. Close, but not tied to. See you next time.